Lecture 7, Hegel's Philosophical Conception of History.
In the last lecture, we saw how German writers such as Herder and Fichte and others of their generation began to stress the distinctiveness of national cultures, national histories, and in the importance of trying to understand the spirit of a particular people. And in this way, I was suggesting that the revolutionary upheavals of the late 18th century strongly influenced the emergence of new conceptions of history, as well as new social and political theories such as nationalism. And it's this new philosophical interest in history that I want to discuss in this lecture, with special attention to the ideas of Hegel. Now, the early 19th century was a period in which modern historical consciousness became a central component of intellectual life, somewhat like science emerged as a key element of thought at the end of the 17th century. We can almost think of the early 19th century as a period of the historical revolution. But of course, people had studied history since antiquity. There had always been historians, and especially since the Renaissance, there had been a lot of historical writing. And the Enlightenment itself had produced some very important historical works. For example, important books by Voltaire, who wrote a study of the reign of Louis XIV in the 17th century. Or the works of Edward Gibbon, who wrote the great book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in the late 18th century. So there was a lot of historical writing in the 18th century. But many of the philosophers were more interested in universal or natural laws, or in various forms of social critique, than in the specific problems of the history of a nation or of a particular group of people. They weren't so interested in the specific traits of past eras. This didn't mean that the philosophers ignored history, but they always looked for signs of progress in history, or they looked for events in the past that seemed to be leading toward their own view of the world. So they could condemn the Middle Ages for being a time of superstition. They wouldn't have much interest in a culture that they didn't believe expressed reason. But during the period of the Revolutionary Wars, the period of the Napoleonic Wars, a whole set of new questions were raised about the nature of progress and about the alternatives to Enlightenment conceptions of truth. And we've begun talking about the philosophical components of this critique of the Enlightenment. And it was in this context, this new cultural and political context, that history provided valuable intellectual resources for people who sought to explain the meaning of contemporary events, or for people who wanted to challenge the legacy of 18th century thought. Historical studies offered a new form of truth, a new form of social and political analysis. We've already seen how writers like Burke or Herder or Fichte emphasized the importance of national cultural particularities, how they looked at the distinctiveness of each nation and its traditions. And I think these kinds of ideas very much stimulated the search for historical knowledge, because the only way you could know about a specific human society or about what made a culture distinctive was to look at its history. And this kind of knowledge showed the meaning and the cultural value of the past. So the reaction to the French Revolution stimulated a whole explosion of historical study and historical information. And yet this new knowledge about the past would only be a mass of unrelated facts, almost disjointed information, if it lacked some kind of philosophy to give it meaning or coherence. And this was precisely the intellectual achievement of Hegel. Hegel gave a philosophical coherence to the study of every kind of historical information. Hegel lived from 1770 to 1831, and in his work he tried to identify historical meanings, universal historical meanings even, in specific national histories and specific national eras or historical eras. For Hegel and his many 19th century followers, history revealed the highest truths of human experience. That history showed what human beings had accomplished. History showed the development of human ideas. So it was Hegel and Hegelian philosophy that enabled a later generation of writers and historians to find philosophical significance in every historical event. And so in this lecture, I want to try to understand how Hegel's thought evolved and why it was so important. Hegel was both the culmination of earlier developments in German thought and the starting point for the next half-century of philosophical theories in Germany and in many other parts of Europe. And in this respect, Hegel was the German intellectual equivalent of the French Revolution. He was something like an event that influences future thought, but an event that is also the culmination of what had come before. Much like the French Revolution was both the culmination of the Enlightenment, but then the starting point for a whole series of future debates and ideas. So Hegel was an event in German culture that might be compared to the French Revolution and in terms of producing a whole series of future intellectual discourse. Now, Hegel drew partly on the Enlightenment to stress the importance of reason. He had a fascination with reason, but he also drew on German idealism to emphasize the power of the mind, or the power of the idea moving through history. And Hegel was also influenced by many other strands of late 18th century German thought, especially the new Romanticism that was emerging at the end of the 18th century and challenging the philosophers, stressing the organic unfolding of life and culture across time. So one way to describe Hegel's conception of history would be to say that it's a very ambitious attempt to synthesize Enlightenment reason, German idealism, German Romanticism, and the Western philosophical or theological tradition. It's an enormous project of bringing together different strands of thought. And it was this enormous philosophical project, this enormous synthesis, that gave Hegel's thought its importance, because the range of its intellectual themes, the range of its themes appealed to a very wide range of early 19th century intellectuals and writers. People could come to Hegel from a whole variety of other traditions, including the Enlightenment or Romanticism or various forms of theology and classical philosophy. Now, Hegel described history as a process of endless change, in which a transcendent spirit, a higher spirit, evolves with purpose and direction across time. And this explanation for endless change and endless conflict gave meaning to the violent upheavals of the recent past, as well as to the events of all former societies. If you could follow this theory, you could see that every event had meaning, no matter how chaotic, no matter how absurd it might seem. And it was this ability to give meaning to recent events that I think accounts for much of Hegel's influence after 1815. He gave people a way to explain the meaning of the French Revolution or the meaning of Napoleon. But to understand Hegel's influence, we need to look more specifically at the themes of his philosophy, the specific themes. And what I want to do now is move from the general claim about his importance to a series of observations about his specific ideas or themes. Hegel developed the themes of his work and achieved his fame as a professor in universities at Jena and Heidelberg and finally in Berlin. And it was in Berlin that he delivered his famous lectures on the philosophy of history during the 1820s. But Hegel, although he was an extremely cerebral writer, and no doubt an extremely cerebral professor, also was very engaged with the people of his own time. He had lots of friends. He commented often on politics. He had an active family life. He was not like a kind of Newtonian saint figure. Remember, Newton was very much isolated in certain ways in his world of thought, although he also had friends. But Newton never had as many political or cultural or family involvements as Hegel. So Hegel was a cerebral thinker, but a man very engaged with his own time and his own culture. He was also very interested in the French Revolution. As a young man, in his early 20s, he supported the revolution. He was part of a group of German students who followed events in France very, very closely. And he was fascinated by Napoleon. He never was a militant supporter of Napoleon, but he had an interest in Napoleon. He seemed to respect him. He was certainly fascinated by Napoleon. And he never became a radical critic of Napoleon. In fact, at one time he was the editor of a newspaper that published generally sympathetic commentaries on the Napoleonic project. So he was, in some ways, more interested in Napoleon and in France than many of the other German nationalists of the early 19th century. Now, in his lectures, Hegel drew very large crowds. He was a popular lecturer. He attracted not only students but people from the Berlin intellectual community. And in some ways, he was still at the height of his intellectual powers when he died in 1831 during the cholera epidemic, which struck Berlin in the early 1830s. And he died before he had finished his writings on history. Recent historians have argued that perhaps he didn't actually die from the cholera, but he died during the cholera epidemic, but he may have had some other problems that caused his death. No one knows exactly why he died, but he was only 61 years old when he died. But after his death, his loyal students published the material from his lectures on history and published a book called Introduction to the Philosophy of History. And this is the work of Hegel's that I want to discuss here, because I'm stressing Hegel's influence on historical thought. He published other works, of course, and he lectured on many other themes, but it's the historical theories that I want to stress here. Now, Hegel drew on Romanticism in his emphasis on the evolution of history and the unfolding spiritual processes of cultural change. Romanticism often stressed the organic unfolding of human experience. And this is part of what Hegel was interested in. But many of the Romantics became what were called subjective idealists. That is, they argued that each individual must express transcendent or spiritual truths in his or her own way. An idea that leads toward a belief in an isolated genius. This was the Romantic idea of the creative genius, that this person has a vision and expresses it in his or her own way, subjectively. Hegel, on the other hand, favored something we might call objective idealism, in which the individual must try to comprehend the rationality of a transcendent spirit and then conform to its unfolding development. So, as an individual, you can't simply express whatever you feel or whatever you think. You can't do whatever you want to do. You should try to use philosophy to understand the spirit and follow its direction. You have to objectively comprehend how the spirit is unfolding across time. But this, of course, raises the question, how do people know the meaning or the direction of the spirit? If your task is to identify with it and to somehow act in accordance with its unfolding across time, how do you find out what the spirit is doing or what the spirit wants? And this is the importance of history. Because according to Hegel, you must look to history to see the unfolding of the spirit. And this is why history is the source of knowledge. This is why history, for Hegel and for his followers, becomes one of the highest forms of understanding. Now, how do we describe the spirit? This is an extremely abstract idea. The spirit, or idea, embodies what Hegel called reason or freedom. And the philosopher can discern the unfolding of reason and of freedom in history rather than in nature or in the Bible. So the way you see freedom growing across time is by looking at history, and this is how you understand the nature of the spirit. Now, these themes in Hegelian thought have sometimes been described as a restatement of the classical Western worldview, the theological worldview in modern secularized form. Because Hegel believed, like Christianity, that history has meaning. Everything that happens in history has some meaning, maybe some kind of purpose. Even when it appears to be chaotic, even when it appears to lack direction, the events of history have a fundamental unity, a fundamental meaning, because whatever happens expresses the unfolding of this world spirit. Much as Christians might say that whatever happens in the world expresses some part of the divine will or the divine purpose in human activities. Now, as I said, this spirit for Hegel is connected to something he calls the idea or reason or freedom. And much as in the religious tradition, Hegel argued that in the beginning, this idea became separated from itself. And when that happened, the historical process began. The spirit became separated from the realm of pure abstraction or transcendence and somehow entered into the material world of human beings. So as in the Christian story, there was an original unity in the spirit, but then there was a separation. The spirit became alienated from itself. And history, all of human history, is the story of the spirit's long journey back toward unity, back toward reconciliation with itself. So human history, according to Hegel, shows the growth of reason and freedom as the spirit evolves toward a higher and higher realization of itself in human societies. But this evolution of the spirit is an extremely complicated process, and this process of realization is filled with conflict. It is filled with conflict because there are forces that are challenging this evolving spirit. It is every part of history is revealing some kind of truth because every part of history is expressing some part of the evolving spirit. But the spirit generates conflict. And these themes, the notion of the spirit in human society, in human affairs, is also an important theme of his book, The Phenomenology of the Spirit, or Phenomenology of Spirit, which was published in 1807 and which provides an intellectual context for his later work. In writing about history, he presumed that he had already shown that the spirit is present in the world. And people who don't believe that have a hard time understanding his theory of history, but he presupposed that he had already proven the existence of the spirit in human affairs. Now, although the spirit is always present in history, it takes different expressions in different times. And so the particular expression of the spirit or the idea will always differ in different historical eras. This is the process by which the spirit moves. It is always moving in different periods of time. It's what he called the dialectical process of history. And Hegel argued that reality is never stable or consistent. History is always in movement. This is one of his most important ideas, and it's related to that romantic idea of the organic unfolding across time. But at every moment, history consists of contradictions and conflicts. Since these contradictions, though, operate on the level of the idea, they are described in intellectual terms. That is, ideas negate or oppose each other. So for Hegel, history is a constant process of negation, of opposition, and this is what creates the conflict. Now, this dialectical process of intellectual negation appears in the interaction of the thesis and the antithesis, which became a very famous theme in the Hegelian view of history. It became very important for many of his followers, perhaps in some ways even more important for his followers than for Hegel himself. But the notion of the thesis and the antithesis is always connected with Hegelian thought. You have an idea, which is the thesis, which gives rise to or is challenged by or negated by an antithesis. And out of this opposition, a conflict arises. A conflict between the opposing ideas. And out of the conflict, gradually, there arises a higher synthesis, which preserves what is essential from each side, the thesis and the antithesis, and lifts it to a higher level. This synthesis then becomes the new thesis, which expresses the advance or progress of the idea or reason or freedom in history. And so we constantly have a new conflict arising. The synthesis becomes a new thesis, which gives rise to a new conflict, a new set of ideas which oppose it. To put this in more concrete terms, we might think of an idea like monarchy. That government should be in the hands of a king. But then, that could be the thesis. Then the antithesis would suggest, well, we should have a democracy in which the power is in the hands of all of the people, not in the hands of a king. And then you have a kind of creative struggle between these two ideas, and perhaps out of that comes the synthesis. Maybe the idea of a constitutional monarchy, a monarch controlled in some way by the people. And then that in turn gives rise to yet other critiques, people who want to promote a different kind of democracy or a different kind of authority, and so on and so on. This is the dialectical process of thesis and antithesis. But Hegel thought that history has meaning because as it goes forward, it accumulates more and more elements of the truth, more and more elements of the idea. And conflict is therefore intrinsic to the historical process. But conflict is useful. It's not a bad thing. Conflict is useful. It is necessary in that it contributes to the advance toward a final harmony or synthesis. And whereas many people had always lamented the conflict of history, Hegel could look at great conflicts and say, out of this conflict, the spirit will rise to a higher level. Now, all of this theory gives great support to the study of history. It's a theory that historians obviously like because it suggests that history is the path to truth. We may not see the idea or the spirit operating clearly in our own moment or culture, but we can see it in the events of history. As Hegel put it in one of his most quoted phrases, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. Minerva was the ancient Roman goddess of wisdom who had an owl, and that owl would take flight at dusk, which is a way of saying we can only have wisdom at the end of the day through history. This is one of my favorite expressions because if we think that we can only understand things when we look back on them, it is a way of understanding why we're so confused in the midst of a public conflict or a revolution or a political campaign. We can't see where it's going or what's at stake. Just like we can't see in our own personal lives. You know how when you're in the middle of a great conflict or a problem, you can't really see where it's going. But then you look back and you'll say something like, oh, if I had only known then what I know now. That's what we might call a Hegelian moment in your personal life, because you can see a pattern, you can see a meaning in the confusion which at the time you couldn't understand. And so, in a way, we might say the motto, the slogan for this course is the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. But the philosophical comprehension of history can turn to every historical period, and this is the other great liberating thing about Hegel's theory, because every past era reflects some stage of the spirit, some aspect of this evolving idea. And this view, the view that every era has a distinctive spirit or essence, fostered the concept of historicism. Historicism is the idea that each era in history has a distinctive characteristic. It has its own spirit. So, for example, the Middle Ages are important to study because they reveal aspects of the unfolding of the spirit. So where the philosophers might not have had interest in the Middle Ages, a Hegelian might say, let's look at the Middle Ages and see what the spirit is doing at that point. But the spirit also appears in the French Revolution. The spirit appears in Napoleon. Because each age, each crisis, each event has its own distinctive spirit, which historians can discover and describe. It's what Hegel's followers would call the zeitgeist or the spirit of the time. The zeitgeist is the spirit which is embodied in a particular cultural moment. And so the leaders, the institutions, the conflicts of every age are ways of seeing where the spirit is operating. But also in every age, the spirit will give rise to conflict, and out of that conflict we can see progress across time. Because various aspects of reason and freedom are always facing their antitheses. And when they face their antithesis, a new struggle develops, new stages of history emerge from the conflicts. So even the most terrible dramatic events, a French Revolution, a vast Napoleonic War, these terrible events are simply phases of a spirit unfolding in the world. A critic said, this is a way of simply glossing over the terror of the world, the violence, the conflict. It's a way of being complacent. But Hegel said, no, this is a way of finding meaning in even the most horrible events. Now, when Hegel himself talked about the idea in his own time, in the 1820s, he tended to locate it in the Prussian state. He said that if you want to follow the spirit, you might see that it has achieved a very high level of expression in the Prussian government and in the laws of the state in Berlin. But it didn't have to mean that. And some of Hegel's followers immediately seized on something else that Hegel said. Because Hegel said the real is rational and the rational is real. And this could mean two different things. It could mean that the existing order is rational and an expression of the spirit, therefore we should follow it and respect it. But it could also mean that the rational idea could become more real in future institutions and moments of history. And these contrasting implications of the theory soon led to the emergence of right and left Hegelians, conservatives and radicals. The conservative Hegelians said the real is rational. What exists is the embodiment of the spirit. The radical Hegelians said, no, the real is not yet rational, but the rational can become real, and our job is to promote the spirit until it reaches reality in new institutions. But the real significance of Hegel, as I'm describing it here, lays more in his description of historical processes than in his specific commentaries on the political situation in Prussia in the 1820s. Because it was through Hegel and his followers that German thought became profoundly historical, seeking truth in history and historical studies. And historical studies in the later 19th century moved steadily away from Hegel's abstractions. But the confidence in history remained very strong in German thought. And in fact, the modern historical profession emerged in Germany. The German conceptions of history carried several key ideas or beliefs. For example, the belief that history consists of unending change, but that this change always has meaning, and that this change reveals clear patterns of development. The Hegelian conception of history also encouraged the idea that history will always consist of conflicts, but the conflict is a mechanism of progress. And these conflicts can be understood through analysis of a dialectical process in which ideas always face contradictions or negations. And this was a view of history that stressed that all places and all periods in history carry importance and therefore should be studied. And all of these ideas gave a great boost to the study of history. And in fact, Hegelian ideas entered very widely into the modern historical study of the humanities and social systems and politics. And in fact, this course itself, this course on intellectual history, exemplifies the Hegelian legacy because we are trying to trace the evolution of ideas in specific historical contexts in order to understand how at particular moments in time a kind of zeitgeist, a kind of spirit of the times emerged in a social and political and cultural spirit of the times. But now we need to turn to another response to this period and look at liberalism and see how it offered an alternative to the Hegelianism we've just been talking about.